Special thanks to our podcast sponsors, Brigitte and Bashar Kalai, Hallie Vanderheider, and Sippy and AJ Karana.
At Crime Stoppers of Houston, we believe in safety for all, and to achieve that, it's necessary to have balanced conversations where all are represented. Here's where we come together to do just that. Welcome to The Balanced Voice.
Today on The Balanced Voice, we sit down to interview local domestic violence survivor Meghan Verikas, who did the absolutely unimaginable and faked her own kidnapping to escape her high-profile abuser. Meghan bravely shares her raw story and her experience navigating our legal system as a victim. Meghan's shocking story has gained national media attention over the years, including a Dateline exclusive linked in our show notes at thebalancedvoicepodcast.com. At Crime Stoppers of Houston, we believe in elevating the voices of survivors, and we recognize that sharing her story is an incredibly difficult feat. Meghan, thank you for sharing your story. By doing so, you're advocating for those who have not yet found their voice. Without further ado, here's your host, Rania Mankarios.
Welcome to the Balanced Voice podcast. Today's guest is an incredible person with an unbelievable story, one many of you may have heard something about. Meghan Verikas agreed to fake her own kidnapping so police could catch her ex-boyfriend, former Houston doctor Leon Jacob. Jacob was accused of orchestrating a murder for hire scheme to ultimately kill you. It is such an honor to have you on the program. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
I appreciate having me.
There's so many places we can dive in to start talking about your incredible journey, but I'd like you to take us back to when you met Leon and how your relationship formed and how he was as a boyfriend.
Initially, Leon was a wonderful boyfriend with a wonderful family. I moved here to Houston with him. We had a lovely home in West University, and it was nice. And then things definitely changed after being here only 1 month. I started to see a different side of him. Turned into a lot of mental, abuse. And then financially, he just wasn't the person that he had claimed to be. So there started to be some gaps in who I knew him to be.
Meghan, why do you think the relationship turned the way that it turned and ultimately Leon developed this scheme to try to end your life? Why do you think that happened?
Knowing what I know now, Leon clearly had a history of abuse from not only what he had done to me, but his relationships in the past. And this was something that was in his character, unfortunately.
How did it happen that you found yourself in a scenario where you were going to pretend that you were being kidnapped or that you were taken? How did that unfold? Whose idea was it, and what was the ultimate goal?
I think that a lot led up to that. Initially, I decided to leave Leon after a really bad incident where he had put his hands on me, and that led to me leaving everything, leaving my home, leaving my dog, leaving everything. And I filed family violence charges. Thankfully, I had a wonderful police officer after sitting outside of the Travis Street police station almost 3 days, just going and waiting. And he encouraged me to file a report for family violence. And then I continued to work with him as Leon stalked me and filed a protective order as well. And it just escalated from there. I had received a call from HPD, and obviously I was apprehensive that I didn't think it was them because of how much Leon had done to try and reach me. And they had told me there was a credible threat on my life and that I had to leave. I used my own money to go to Pittsburgh and be with my family for an extended period of time until I received another phone call for them to tell me to return to Houston. On that day, I went straight to work after getting off of a plane, and they called me while I was in the middle of a meeting and picked me up outside of my job and took me to take photographs. And when I got out of the police officer's vehicle, I noticed there was somebody else there, and they kind of told me what was going to happen, and that Leon and his new girlfriend decided to have us both killed.
It's an obvious question, and in the sense that one can only imagine, but how did you feel in that moment? What are the thoughts and emotions that go through somebody's head in a moment like that?
I don't think words can truly describe it. It's funny because I knew after everything I'd gone through that Leon was capable of doing something like this. But the fact that I was there sitting in this place that, luckily I was with police, but I was physically shaking because I was so scared. This could have really happened to me. And these type of things really do happen to other women, and I was so fortunate to be with police officers and not with him.
We've done a lot of discussions this month on domestic violence and domestic violence awareness. And I'm always reading about these cases and being asked, why don't girls just leave? Why don't they just pick up and leave? And we know that it's very complicated. And for someone to walk out of an abusive situation, we always say it doesn't just require a plan. It requires like a strategic plan. You mentioned your dog, you mentioned your home, your place of business. There's a lot of different parts, moving parts. But I always think when you're in a situation, and in this case, Leon seemed to have this other relationship that he's involved with, do you ever just stop and ask, why don't you just let me be? Go be with this new person. Leave me alone and let me go on and live my own life. I mean, why does it turn violent? What do you think now, looking back and having had time to think back on what happened to you? Do you have any idea why that's the case?
It was definitely a pattern with him. He had done this to his first wife. He had done this to other women. So it certainly wasn't something new to him. I wish it was that simple. And I think that's why there continues to be this issue, because I don't know why. That's the logical thing. That would be logical for somebody to move on. And I don't think he was capable of that. And he was a predator, and he would have continued to do this if he was not in jail.
You found yourself that day now walking through the criminal justice system as a victim, somebody who, we always quote Andy Kahn, who says, that you had no interest in being a part of this. You had no intention of being a part of this, and you were pulled into it against your will, the only unwilling participant in this process. How did it feel to go through the criminal justice system, to watch what was unfolding from a victim's perspective? Were you given information before other people were given information? Were you handheld through the process? Were you comforted through the process? How did it feel? What was it like?
Initially, it was very frustrating. Like I said, I had gone to the police station to file report after report and turn over evidence of stalking for weeks before I was even able to get a protective order. And then the process of getting a protective order and sitting in an office with dozens of people waiting to be called on to speak to somebody and tell your story, and then to have to wait further and for a hearing, it's traumatic. And I'm sure that I could have gotten a lawyer and expedited the process, but I didn't know where to start. So I just kept going into these offices, and I did meet with some really wonderful people. But once it escalated to the point where the police were involved, and we'd gotten to all of that, it was very frustrating as a victim not to be told things and then see it on the media. And I know that my case is a little bit different, but the lack of communication in regards to court hearings and, not knowing until the day before, I was still trying to function and have a normal job and be able to pay bills while ensuring that I was keeping him in jail. And it was very difficult. So I think I'm fortunate because I did have more support than most. But I couldn't imagine going through this process with children. And I know a lot of women do. And it's scary.
After he was arrested, did you hear from him again? I mean, you're navigating this process. You're not being told what's going on. You're trying to maintain some type of normalcy. But you have this in the back of your mind, such a huge issue. Were you also hearing from him or anyone?
After the assault on a family member charge, he continued to obviously stalk me. He came to my work. He would call, he would have other people call. He would have people contact my job and say that, I was doing illegal things and that I should be fired. He was doing everything possible for me to speak to him again. And then once the stalking charge had been put in place, that was the same day that my protective order, and I will never forget standing there. And I guess the attorney that was representing me, she stood next to me and she said, "It's going to be okay, because after this, no matter what happens, he's going to be arrested for stalking." And I had this sense of relief for, okay, so I can leave here and he's going to be in jail. And then literally less than 48 hours later, he was out again on the stalking charge. And it was just scary. He's mad. I've gotten him arrested twice now. And all I kept thinking about is, how am I going to stay safe? Because this piece of paper that I have now really isn't going to help me. So that was really scary. And then, that's when, in between that time, he came up with this plan and did all of these things. And again, it's by the grace of God that the right people found out about this. And I'm here today, because if he wouldn't have gone to specific people, then the story could have ended very differently.
I sit here and look at the images of your story and the duct tape on your mouth and the plastic cord around your wrists and even staged as part of, what law enforcement asked you to do. I can't even imagine what that felt like for you. And then you add to that the abuse that nobody saw, the, emotional torture that nobody heard or dealt with. And you really start to understand how much a victim goes through, especially in your case. And it's why your story has really become one that everybody across the country has been interested to learn more about. But what's also so interesting is that once the perpetrator is arrested, a victim should immediately start to feel relief. And in your case, it's also been fascinating to see the struggle continue with just the criminal justice system. Can you tell us, beyond not knowing what was happening or hearing about your case from the media, what changes would you have liked to have seen for yourself and for others?
There has to be a way to ensure that the victim's safety is put above all else, especially, when you allow somebody to have bond. Leon had charges in multiple states. He had done this to other women in multiple states. And I think that should have been considered when he was given bond for a first and second time when this occurred with me. So that was very frustrating. And
that's a huge issue. That's a huge issue.
The fact that he did have charges in multiple states and they didn't put any bearing on that when giving him bond is just frustrating. So somebody like him can move from state to state and continue this pattern of harming people.
And when a victim has enough courage to actually get the help that they so desperately need, for the system to then turn around and release this person right back into the community. I mean, I oftentimes sit there and think, have we lost all sense of common sense? What do we expect to happen to the victim when this person is re-released, the perpetrator is re-released into the community?
And, I don't think there's enough consideration on that, and I'm very fortunate that I had the means to stay safe. But there needs to be more. There's definitely resources here in Houston, being a large city, which is wonderful, but the systems that are in place are not easily navigated by victims. They're not very user friendly at all. Like the Vine system, when somebody's getting released from jail, and the phone calls that you receive. And I was afraid to put my number into these things because I obviously needed to be contacted, but then I was worried that somehow he was going to find me through these other avenues, because I was terrified.
When you go back to the beginnings of your relationship, and we try, you're offering potential solutions in terms of identifying issues with the criminal justice system from the victim's perspective. And that's something that we as a community can't take lightly. We have to be looking into these systems. We have to be making changes. I know even just this last year, and the discussion about COVID and the release of inmates, there was a lot of question about, well, will anybody wanted for family violence be released back into the community because of a fear of COVID, a COVID outbreak in Harris County Jail? And that was a very, very important issue for us. But I want to go back even to the beginning stages of your relationship. And, you talk about how great it was in the early months and in the early years. Looking back, or in the early months, looking back, are there now red flags that you can share with other people that are listening, or that may question whether or not they themselves are in a relationship where there are red flags that should be concerning?
I am fortunate enough to have been in therapy from the time that I left Leon. I was able to work with ABDA and had a wonderful therapist. And there is a lot that you learn by going through that. And, they do say hindsight is 20/20. And there were a lot of signs that I just kind of brushed under the rug. How he treated other people, how he spoke to me in front of other people. There clearly were things that I should not have ignored. And the trust that I had because of his family was also something. And I think that's really what kind of made me rethink everything, because if his family was, telling me these things, then maybe I was okay. But, if you have that feeling in your gut, then it's probably right. And I can't say that if I would have left earlier, because, the first month I moved here, with him, he threw my clothes on a balcony and told me he was going to burn the apartment, and I stayed. So I don't know if it would have ended any differently if I would have left sooner, but
Mm-hmm.
And I really wish that I would have listened to the things that other people had said. But again, you have to make that decision for yourself. And it hit me like a ton of bricks after he put his hands on me, that everything that I'd heard about how he treated his ex-wife, the things that he'd done in the past, all of it made sense. It was like a light bulb went off, and I knew that it was the truth and that everybody else had been lying to me.
One of the things we always talk about is never give somebody in an abusive situation an ultimatum, that you have to make the decision on your own, and that we have to be supportive of you while you navigate making that decision. If you notice, though, that somebody now in your family circle or social circle or work circle may be a victim of domestic violence, what is your suggestion in approaching them?
I've dealt with this with some employees, and think that you give them the resources, and when they have that education and kind of see it full circle, that helps, and it empowers them to make that choice. Being supportive for somebody, I think, and just listening and letting them know that there are options. I think a lot of times finances are a big issue, especially when people have children. But there are resources, and, it's not going to be easy, but to be, just somebody to listen. Obviously, it's their choice to make, but, you can get out of it if that's what you decide.
The trial in your case was incredible, and the twisted plot to ultimately end your life also involved the alleged potential killing of another person. Were you learning this through the trial, and what was that like? What was it like sitting there and seeing Leon in court? I mean, how did that feel?
Seeing Leon in court was difficult. He was arrogant. He thought that just like everything else, he was going to get away with this, and he was going to, walk away and become a doctor or surgeon, and I wasn't allowed to be in the courtroom a majority of the time, but, listening to the people testify of the extreme measures that he'd taken to follow me and come to my work, I only knew it from my perspective, but to hear it from these other people that were part of this plan, it was really scary. Because again, if one thing had been done differently, I may not be here. That's the frightening part. If one person wouldn't have made a phone call or done something, it could have ended very differently. That in the fact that it wasn't just me. He wanted my parents. He wanted anybody he possibly could to hurt me. And it was disgusting.
We see many cases where abusers obviously have their eye on their victim, but also the children, the animals, the extended family within, that are related or associated with the victim. In your case, because it was so unbelievable, media was very involved, local and national media. What was that experience like? How were you treated by media? And was it ultimately something that you were thankful for, that your story was being told, or was it a hindrance to you in any way?
Initially it's very difficult to, obviously you're trying to live a normal life. You're trying to work and get through the day. So when you have people showing up at your job with cameras, asking to speak with you, interrupting your place of business, or you're seeing your face on television and you didn't agree to it, or you're eating breakfast and suddenly there's your abuser on a 10-minute interview that you knew nothing about. It's really difficult to live and just to function. And there were some people that were very respectful, and there were others that were just plain aggressive. My parents live in Pittsburgh, and they received phone call after phone call. I have a very unique last name, so it was easy to track down anybody related to me. And, my aunt, my uncle have a business, and their business was being contacted. My brother was getting phone calls. They didn't understand how this affects somebody who's gone through this. Yes, they're trying to get a story, but I'm a real person. This is my real life. And it was hurtful. I was on a business trip, and somebody had gotten my cell phone number after, I had ensured that I didn't have any way of people getting that. And then they called me and they told me, well, the Houston Police Department gave it to us. I find that very hard to believe. And it was just insulting that they thought it was okay to contact somebody that had gone through this for their own personal benefit. ultimately, when I decided that I wanted to talk to media, I did it with the people who were respectful.
That was the Andrew Canning interview?
Correct. So the producers of Dateline work with KPRC, and they had reached out to me. I had very limited social media, and I still do because I'm very apprehensive about that. They reached out to me through LinkedIn. Obviously, I kept that because of, my profession. And she was just, very kind in what she had said. And I thought that that was the appropriate way to go about it. And I appreciated that. Not calling my place of business, not, showing up at my place of business. That was, and they kind of left it open-ended that, when I'm ready to talk, they would be there. And I appreciated that.
You mentioned sort of and we all know there was massive media coverage. There was a lot of interest in this story, and what is a news story is, as you say, your real life and you're a real person. And people have to take that into consideration and remember this. Do you feel now that you're defined by this? And if so, does it give you this sense of power? Do you feel powerful? And the fact that you've overcome it and you're such an unbelievable example of a survivor? Or do you feel like you don't want to be defined by this?
I feel like something good has to come from something so awful. There has to be a reason why I ended up in Houston. There has to be a reason why I was able to go through this. So I do see it as something that defines me in a good way. And that I use this to help other people, whether it be, just speaking to them and helping them get through a situation, whether it be to raise money for one of these great organizations, but something good has to come from something so awful. And the fact that there is media interest, if that can be parlayed into something to benefit one of these organizations that help me, then I'm all for it.
Meghan, your story is so unbelievable, and you're an inspiration to so many. You're an absolute example of how powerful a person can be. We thank you because you've partnered with Crime Stoppers to share your story, and we know that your intent is to help women moving forward. Do you feel free? Do you feel free at this time? Do you still feel afraid?
That's definitely an interesting question, because you go through the trial and, it was important for me to give a victim impact statement. And that was a very difficult thing to do, which is a whole nother topic in itself. I cannot explain how quickly that happens after a verdict. But I definitely feel better, but I think it's always in the back of your mind, especially that now that we made it through the appeals, I definitely feel better. But I think that is always weighing on me. What if he gets out? What happens then? And again, I'm so thankful that we made it through the appeals, because he took every opportunity to appeal. And that was 2 years worth of hearings and being on edge. So I definitely feel more comfortable, but I don't think that I'll ever be completely released of everything until there's some finality.
How long is he serving?
He's a life sentence, but he's eligible for parole after 30 years. So,
Meghan, your story, as I said, is an unbelievable one. We cannot thank you enough for sharing it with our audience on The Balanced Voice and with the Crime Stoppers community. We want to encourage people to be mindful of the topic of domestic violence and certainly the impact it has on victims, known and unknown, near and far, from all walks of life. So we thank you for your powerful message, and we definitely look forward to having you with us again very, very soon. So thank you again, and thank everybody for tuning in. We'll catch you next time, guys. Bye-bye. Hi, everybody. We're thrilled to be joined with Amy Smith, Deputy Director at Harris County Domestic Violence Coordinating Council. Amy, just listened to Meghan Verikas' interview, and we wanted to sit with her and talk about our takeaways. Of course, October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and Amy's doing a tremendous amount in Houston and in Harris County on this effort. So, Amy, first of all, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I mean, Amy, you heard Meghan speak, you heard her story. It's really overwhelming, but let's just start with the basics. Could you just define domestic violence?
Domestic violence is a pattern of behavior that happens over time. And so it's not just a one-shot kind of thing. It's something that can gradually build up. Listening to Meghan's story, you can just hear how the offender kept manipulating her and sucking her into the power and control, moving her away from her friends and family and isolating her and bringing her to a new town to kind of have more control over her. And she talked a little bit about, like his finances weren't what they said, which is a very real thing that happens in domestic violence cases, is financial abuse as well. And so it was so interesting listening to her story. And I know she has so much guilt for how she got into this, but she shouldn't. Everyone knows that abusers are charming. They're manipulative, and it can happen to anyone.
It is actually really unbelievable to hear her talk about how she found herself in the relationship and then eventually in Houston and away from everybody. And we've been talking about domestic violence. Our organizations have been working together for the longest time. But this year with COVID, so much has changed. How are you seeing it change this year?
Well, it's kind of like shelter in place is great to prevent the spread of the virus. However, it's very dangerous for people that are in a domestic violence situation. The people that are able to help are not readily out there. What I mean by that is that shelters had to socially distance, and so they had to reduce their numbers. What we saw is at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw calls for service to law enforcement go down, but calls for service to the hotline go up. The hotline calls also were information on help with rent and help with food and utilities. So there's a lot of other stressors going in with people not working as many hours. You have your children at home having to do the homeschooling and things like that. So there's a lot of other stressors that are coming in, and there's no way to, if you're at home, to separate. There's no way to, be gone for a couple hours, go to work, send the kids to school. There's also no other eyes on that particular family. There's no coworker. There's no child's teacher. There's no one that's in there like looking in and making sure that everyone's okay. As the pandemic went on, the calls for service to law enforcement went up. What was interesting is that the calls came in were for cases that were more severe, that were more violent. So we don't know if people were waiting to call until they couldn't take it anymore, or if because of the pandemic and being at home, that the violence became so much more severe.
We always like to wrap up these conversations with takeaways. And as Meghan was talking, she talked about protective orders, bond issues. She talked about the standing of the victims in the system. What were your takeaways from what she said? What were your key takeaways?
Well, as you all know, and as you guys always mention, is that the victim isn't always the person that is not the unwilling participant. And what I mean by that is that the only person that's responsible for the violence is the person perpetrating the violence. It's not the victim. Yes, there are tools in place that can help the victim, but a protective order is only as good as the person that's going to listen to the protective order. Right now in Harris County, the court systems are so backed up that it's really hard to get a protective order. So each individual victim has their own safety plan and has their own ways of protecting. What might work for some might not work for others. While a protective order could help some people, it might not be the best solution for others. As I said, there's a backlog in the protective orders right now, so it's taking a while to get your permanent protective order. yes, there's some temporary protective orders. If that's in place, there is still some protection. But again, if somebody is not willing to listen to a judge, then a protective order is just a piece of paper. What the protective order can do is also allow the person and the police to know that there is a person that is protected under there. So then they can have criminal ramifications if they violate that protective order. But what we're seeing right now, as far as the bond issues are concerned, is that domestic violence offenders are getting out just as quickly as everybody else is.
Which is terrifying. I mean, when you think about what a woman or what a victim has to do to finally get out of this situation, law enforcement's come in, they've intervened, and now that person goes right back home to the family.
It takes a lot. It takes courage. It takes strength to make that call, to get help. And then we as a community right now are failing them because we're letting these abusers out without any ramifications for it. So that's kind of what's difficult, is trying to get our leaders to see that there's a whole group of people that are being victimized over and over and over again, not only by their perpetrator, but by the system as well, because they're being let out. So it's really important to make sure that there's a safety plan in place. There's a safety plan in place. The best thing to do is to contact a domestic violence service provider. You can reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233, and they can connect you to a local domestic violence shelter that can help you with safety planning, with what you need to do to make yourself safe. What I would like everyone to know is that the strongest people I know are domestic violence survivors, because they did what they had to do to survive. We are not here to judge you how you did it or how you got through, but you survived, and you should be grateful for that. And you are the strongest people that we know are these survivors.
Amy Smith, Deputy Director, Harris County Domestic Violence Coordinating Council, and longtime friend of Crime Stoppers of Houston. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. If you missed anything from the show, check out the show notes at thebalancedvoicepodcast.com. This episode was edited and mixed by the team at Real News PR. Our executive producer is Sydney Zeicher. Our advising producer is Katie Meyer. Our media and quality assurance director is Tanya Cruz. And finally, our creative design director is Elizabeth McChesney. To find out more information about Crime Stoppers of Houston or to get involved with our prevention programming, please visit us at crime-stoppers.org. You can find us on Instagram at The Balanced Voice Podcast, and you can find me online at The Rania Report.